Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's local government education program that's being provided to you by the University of Illinois Extension in partnership with the Illinois Association of County Administrators, the Illinois Association of County Board Members, Northern Illinois University Center for Governmental Studies, and Northern Illinois University School of Public and Global Affairs. We very much appreciate this opportunity for program collaboration in this most difficult time. My name is Kathy Brown, and I serve as a community and economic development educator for the University of Illinois Extension. You may have noticed that all of, except for the presenters' microphones will be muted, and we do this for sound quality. The meeting is being recorded. If you do have problems with your connections, the sound, add those questions to the chat space and someone will be able to troubleshoot with you. We'll monitor that chat space and respond to those questions. We're also going to provide in the chat space, there's a phone number where you can dial in and listen to the presentation. You wouldn't be able to see the visuals, but you would be able to participate and hear the audio. Today's webinar is Cutback Budgeting for Local Governments, and this presentation is going to suggest 3 points to guide cutback budgeting using research from previous recessions. The focus is threefold: leadership and management of cutback budgeting decisions, framing cutback discussions, and thinking about immediate and long-term strategies. In addition, the Illinois Association of County Boards will provide an update on legislative issues and federal funding. Know that there will be a recording of the webinar that will be made available on our local government education website and YouTube channel. And participants will receive slides, links to resources, and the recording for today's webinar. To get us started today, I'm going to ask Kelly Murray, the Executive Director for the Illinois Association of County Board Members, to give a brief welcome, and I'll follow with an introduction and lineup for today's webinar. Kelly?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Again, I appreciate the long-term partnership we have with the University of Illinois Extension, and I thank them for hosting these very timely COVID-19 related webinars. I know from the feedback I have received over the past couple months that these webinars have proven very valuable, I think, to local officials at all levels during this time. So today we are very fortunate to have presenters with exceptional backgrounds and experience in financial management. So as you are all dealing with your budget adjustments and preparations for the coming year, I'm confident that you're going to walk away from this today with some useful knowledge to assist in the process. So again, thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us. The Illinois General Assembly, as you know, they adjourned the 2020 spring session. It was in the very early morning hours of May 24th. When I say early morning hours, it was around 2 a.m. The abbreviated calendars that they used focused on bills really related to the COVID-19 emergency, operational issues, and of course the state budget for fiscal year 2021, which begins July 1st. Prior to the start of session, Mr. Anderson and I were in communications, and we also presented to the various House and Senate working groups on the priority agenda we had for county governments, and also some very similar to the other local governments. So as an organization, we pulled back on our adopted 2020 legislative platform as a whole, and accordingly we prioritized our request to the COVID-19 related relief measures. We knew that that's what they would be focusing on primarily. We also communicated and worked in conjunction with the Chief County Assessment Officers, the Sheriff's Association, state's attorneys, treasurers, clerks. We wanted to make sure that when we approached this, we had a cohesive approach to our efforts. And we provided recommended language for various statutory changes. And overall, in my opinion, I think we were all very successful in our approach. I wanted to mention just a couple bills to you because we had received questions on these. So just for clarification, they passed a local government omnibus bill. And this one, a couple things that came out of it was really more in assistance with the townships. And it helped, it was House Bill 2096. And it ensured that aid people received under the CARES Act not be counted against them when they were applying for township general assistance. We felt that was very important. And it also granted the township governments the option to postpone their annual meeting during a disaster declaration. That came to the forefront, and we realized that wasn't allowable in statute. So that was something that needed clarified. Another thing the state did under Senate Bill 2135, they established the Restore Illinois Collaborative Commission. And this commission is going to provide input on plans to revive the various sectors of the state's economy coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. We were asking for a provision as part of that bill, which was a FOIA extension for local governments, due to the fact that many local governments were not operating at full capacity during the last couple months, and were very limited on other issues that they had to address, primarily with COVID-19, so that the FOIA requests coming in, we didn't want to fall behind. But again, the governor's office opposed that component, so that was actually removed from the bill. So your FOIA regulations and responses are still in place at the same time frame as they were prior to. Another thing is that we had questions regarding public hearings being held by teleconference. We do believe that's covered under Senate Bill 2135 because it addressed the open meetings provisions. So therefore, but it still ties your public hearings to the video conference to a disaster declaration. So just understand that. I believe most of you were operating properly, but we did want to make sure that was clarified, and it is under Senate Bill 2135. The other bill was Senate Bill 1863, which is the General Elections Omnibus Bill. You're probably primarily hearing in the news about the vote by mail component. That's the main thing everybody pulled out of there. But we wanted you to keep in mind there's going to be likely costs associated with this bill for your county clerks, possibly election authorities. We want to make sure you stay in contact with the State Board of Elections. The State Board has and is expected to expend funds from the CARES Act to assist with certain local expenditures. We've been told, we're not sure how much of that is going to flow down to local governments. You know, they've referenced software program, mailing costs, supplies, processing equipment, staffing costs. We're not sure how much of that's going to be at the state or at the local levels. So we do anticipate some costs with the election bill, and we'd recommend that your county offices stay in contact with the State Board of Elections on that. Senate Bill 685 was a property tax relief package. This is one that we worked on with the county assessment officers, and primarily it provided some clarification on deferring the tax sales, and it gives counties the ability to extend the homestead exemption and waive late fees. We had a lot of counties taking action in this manner. Some states' attorneys were questioning the statutory language, so again, this provided some clarification on that. It also gives the chief county assessment officers the authority to approve homestead exemptions without applications in 2020. This was a great benefit, and we helped with that, and we want to thank the chief county assessment officers for providing language for that bill, because this will be very beneficial, obviously, for people who have disabilities, veterans with disabilities, and the senior citizens when it comes time for that renewal. So that was a great bill to put through. The last one I wanted to talk about a little bit was House Bill 2455. This was the labor agreement bill dealing with the workers' compensation issue that arose earlier from the governor's administration. This bill is an agreement. It was reached by the manufacturers and organized labor. And if you recall, a lawsuit was filed that blocked the emergency rules put in place by Governor Pritzker's administration that would have required employers to pay workers' compensation benefits if an employee was diagnosed with COVID-19 without proof that the illness was contracted in the workplace. So this bill creates a rebuttal presumption, and that a first responder or essential worker, you know, we have to prove that it was in the line of duty, per se. So this was a very positive change, and I think it was good for our local governments as well. So again, that's House Bill 2455. Now, if you have any questions about these bills that I referenced, I know we are on a short time frame here, please reach out to me, that would be fine. The majority of the measures on our revised policy agenda were approved. We're very happy about that. And most important, certain local revenue rates within the budget were protected. And I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to our legislative consultant, Taylor Anderson, and he's going to summarize the state budget components and kind of provide an update on what we're hearing right now from the Federal CARES Act distributions down to the local governments. Taylor?
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Kelly did an excellent job summarizing some of the action that took place when the General Assembly returned. The biggest item, obviously, was the budget that was passed. When they headed down, the Springfield lawmakers had the intention of keeping the fiscal year 21's budget flat compared to fiscal year 20. That did not happen. It's a little bit of an increase. The budget that was passed is about $42.8 billion for operating budget expenses. One of the key components of this budget is that it does not rely on the fair tax constitutional amendment being approved in November. There was a lot of consternation about how they balance the budget with this fair tax amendment looming overhead, and there was concerns that it would just be financial gimmickry if they used or accounted for those dollars when there was still the measure needed to be approved by voters come November. However, this budget does rely pretty heavily on borrowing. There's a lot of federal borrowing that's going to be taking place. As part of the budget package, there was $5 billion of federal borrowing approved by the General Assembly. They're not anticipating to actually borrow the total amount of that $5 billion, but that does give them up to $5 billion to kind of help the state out. A lot of how much of that $5 billion ends up being borrowed by the state of Illinois will depend upon whether or not there's a fourth phase of financial aid package rolled out by Congress to help combat the corona pandemic, particularly for states. The budget also allows for the governor to move funds from various state funds into the general revenue fund of the state to help with cash flow issues, and they are expecting some of those, especially with, again, the corona or COVID pandemic, but also just to give the governor a little more flexibility. So about $1.5 billion that the governor is going to have discretion over moving between various state funds and into the general revenue fund. I think one of the last things I wanted to touch upon with regards to the budget, and this is very important for us, local governments, counties, municipalities, et cetera, is that last year there was a 5% cut to the local government distributive fund. That is not the case for fiscal year 21. That 5% cut has been restored. However, and I want to be very clear about that, that 5% restoration does not equal the 10% of the local government distributive fund percentage that we were supposed to receive. So we're still vastly lower than the 10% that we had received before the tax increase, the income tax increase went into effect. So just because that 5% has been restored, that was 5% of the, I believe, 6% that we are currently receiving. So there is going to be a little bit more money in the LGDF, but by no means would I want anyone to believe that it's going to be an increase of the local government distributive fund. In fact, there's questions about whether or not the estimates for the amounts of money that the state will collect on income tax will be the same or less than last year. And if that does in fact happen, we could actually see a reduction in the total dollar amount of LGDF, even though our formula, the percentage in the formula has gone up. So again, I just want to be very clear about that. The final thing I want to just talk about is the federal funds that were allocated to units of local government via the CARES Act. As part of the package that was approved by the General Assembly, they established the CARES Act. And what that does is it acts as a financial bank where those CARES dollars are going to be placed, and then those dollars will be allocated out of. The CARES Act gives the DCEO, the Department of Economic Opportunity, a lot of leeway with how they allocate those dollars. When the federal government initially allocated those funds, there was, I think, about a little over $2 billion that was slotted to go to Illinois. Units of local government over $500,000 got a check right off the top of that. And so I believe there's approximately about $800 million or so dollars left from CARES. Those dollars will go into the CURES Act. In my conversations with legislators, they were very clear with me that these dollars, that $800 million or so, is not going to be expressly earmarked for counties or municipalities alone. There's a lot of other units of local government that they feel need access to some of those dollars, including long-term care facilities, EMT, and hospital districts, et cetera. So those dollars, we're going to have to work very closely with DCEO to make sure that counties and municipalities are receiving CARES dollars through the CURES Act. DCEO has not, at this time, to myself and Kelly's knowledge, released how they're going to allocate those dollars, but they're supposed to be promulgating rules. As soon as those rules are out, I know Kelly will make sure that information gets out to everyone. It's going to be very important. That's going to allow us access to those federal funds.
Thank you, Kelly and Taylor. Great update and things that we really want to stay connected with. I can see some follow-up webinars in some of the messages that you shared with us today, so thank you very much. I think we're very fortunate today. As Kelly mentioned, we have a great lineup of local government experts for today's program. I'm going to give you just a brief introduction for each presenter and then turn the program over to our first presenter. I want to remind you that even though your microphones will be muted for sound quality, you can still submit your questions in the chat space, and we'll take time to address your questions at the end of the presentation. We have three exceptional presenters today, all having great expertise in local government, budgeting, and finance. First up will be Chris Goodman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration at Northern Illinois University. Chris will be followed by Kurt Thurmer, and he is a distinguished engagement professor and chair of the Department of Public Administration at Northern Illinois University. And following Kurt will be Michael Van Milligan. And Michael was a former city manager in Illinois. He's now in Dubuque, Iowa, and we welcome all three of these individuals for their expertise and experiences in local government finance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to begin our discussion this afternoon. So Chris Goodman.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. As Laura mentioned, my name is Chris Goodman. I'm an assistant professor at Northern. There's a little bit about me here on the screen. My research largely focuses on special districts, but my teaching side is all in the public finance realm. So you can see here my default class is public revenue systems in Northern's MPA program. So I'm really here to kind of set the stage for our other two presenters. This is probably going to be a little bit of a things you already know kind of session, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Here we go. So a big piece of kind of what's, at least what I see going on here, is both the good and the bad of revenue diversification. So for all of us, the property tax is really kind of the core public revenue. But since the 70s, and it kind of varies by state, certainly in Illinois, we've been kind of shifting away from the property tax to other forms of revenue collection. That's in part responding to dissatisfaction with the property tax. We hear about that all the time in this state, but also as a kind of a push from people like me, professors and consultants and such, that said, there's a lot of benefits to diversifying your revenue streams. So you'll hear me kind of beat this drum multiple times, is that the property tax is good and that it's steady, but also fairly slow growing. So we get consistent revenue over time, but not very quickly growing revenue. Diversification allows us to grow quite a bit faster, but also introduces a fair bit more volatility into our revenue streams. So if we do this well, we can balance this higher growth and volatility, but that's exceedingly difficult to do. That requires us to know a lot about these various revenue streams so we can effectively balance them. I would argue that's nearly impossible to do. So we're trading some higher growth for an increase in volatility. That's fine when the economy is growing. It can present us problems when it's not. So this is, again, the bad, is that the property tax is slow growing. So we've been looking for alternatives. But doing that means in economic downturns, we see revenues go down in ways that the property tax probably wouldn't. And that features of these various revenues, I'll point out one in particular here, can exacerbate this. So for instance, not applying sales taxation to grocery and food purchases for home consumption makes the sales tax more volatile than it would otherwise be, because grocery shopping is fairly consistent regardless of recession or not. So this is kind of the good and the bad of things that we've been trying to do over the years, but it kind of sets the stage for where we are. Another piece is something that the couple of speakers previously have already touched on, is that our current situation is fairly uncertain. So we have some pretty large lags in data, both on revenues that are collected by the state, but also data about how the economy is doing, things like that. We see that with a couple of month lag, so it's difficult to make decisions on the fly. Tied up with this is a rapidly changing situation about what's kind of happening, both in terms of the economy, but also in terms of the kind of ongoing pandemic. At least in the Illinois case, it appears things are getting better, but we don't know how sustainable that is or anything like that. That situation is pretty rapidly changing. So the kind of effect of this is that we won't really know exactly where we stand until pretty far into the future. So, a lot of this presentation is about kind of understanding how that might go. Our probably best lesson is from our kind of prior recession, the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, which really kind of hit local governments in 8 and 9. We saw large declines in both property and sales tax revenues. I wouldn't expect property tax declines in the current state, but I'm willing to be proven wrong. We also saw large reductions in state aid across almost every state in the United States. As states tried to balance their own budgets, this was an easy place to cut. As we just heard, that's not something that appears to be a concern right now, but that's kind of a tepid suggestion. And then kind of overall, the effects on local governments lagged the recession quite a bit. So as the private sector was starting to come out of the Great Recession, the public sector was kind of going further into it. So we'd probably expect to see that again. How did local governments cope? A lot of this was drawing down net assets. So using that savings account to try to smooth revenue collection. Another thing that we saw was fee increases through increasing individual amounts. I would kind of be remiss to not mention that there are some equity concerns with this, that fees are controlled by local governments, but at the same time are paid by citizens. So we might want to think about whether we go down that route or not. Some of the other research has suggested that while general fund revenues were hit pretty hard, total government revenues, so the kind of business-like activity side of the budget, weren't hit as hard. And that may suggest that if those, to the extent that your governments have these, there may be some appropriate interfund transfers that might actually make the blow on general fund revenues not as bad. So that's just my kind of very brief intro to this. I believe all of you will get these slides. Here's my contact information. I'm more than happy to speak to any of you about these issues. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Next up in our presentation will be Kurt Thiermer, and I'll let him get started, but note in your chat space, Nancy has uploaded the results of the poll results, and we really appreciate you giving us your insights where the group is at in terms of budgeting processes today. So Kurt, I'll let you get started.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Having a good revenue forecast is really an essential element of good budgeting. Unfortunately, our current recession is hopefully unique, created by this novel virus pandemic. So we have more uncertainty, or at least it feels like more uncertainty as we find ourselves with these disappearing revenue streams. The uncertainty is coming from notion that, well, we understand economic recessions where, you know, things play out in a fairly typical way. It just feels different because the cause of this recession is different, and we're not sure how fast we'll rebound. So I'm going to highlight 3 principles that research from the last few recessions indicates are important to remember as you approach the cutback budgeting. There really are 2 broad approaches to cutback budgeting. A political approach focuses on spreading the pain equally to minimize political conflicts. You know, we'll all share the pain together. The management approach focuses on strategic plans and priorities as a guiding decision tool that hopes to focus on long-term perspectives that avoids deep cuts to capital maintenance that incur long-term harms to the community and the budget. Needless to say, as an MPA department chair, I recommend the management approach, the big ear to the ground for the political pressures and nuances that we know constrain these strategic choices. So I'm going to discuss 3 principles of cutback budgeting using a management approach that comes out of the research. And then I'm going to demonstrate how I'm using a case simulation in my budgeting course for the MPA program to bring these principles alive to students, because you could use the same software to engage your citizens in the same kind of trade-offs you are facing. So the first principle is that strategic plans and priorities are made for cutback management periods. What are the city's priorities, and how do you protect them as revenues drop? The policy agenda, top priorities, and high priorities that I'm showing you here are from Dubuque, Iowa. They were in the city manager's pre-COVID transmittal letter for the budget. Here you can see that there are in particular 2 priorities, just as an example. One is the Major Streets Improvement Plan, and the other is Crime Prevention Program. But these are the city's top priorities. It would seem important to protect them in a cutback budgeting environment. So as managers, we need to avoid that cut across the board instinct and remember these priorities. We have to frequently remind and ask the question of citizens, department heads, county boards, city councils, why are we treating our top priorities the same way as services that are nice but not essential? Well, poor Charlie Brown, it's raining again in baseball season. Rainy day funds for local governments are created for the first and second year revenue shortfalls, such as the COVID-19 pandemic period. I think it's useful to know that the duration of the last 11 recessions between 1945 and 2001 is 10 months. So the Great Recession lasted a bit longer, but on average, they're about 10 months. So let's say a range 10, 15 months. So it's important for us not to panic. We don't know how long this recession will last, but we know that the average length, and that helps us accordingly. I mean, it's going to be pouring down rain for the next few quarters, and we'll need to respond to that. But the rainy days will end, the regular budget season will go on again, and Charlie Brown will throw another pitch. Here's the key point. If you have a fund balance reserve that you built for a rainy day, now's the time to use it. Why take drastic responses early in a recession period, cutting out positions and so on, when you don't know how long it can be beyond that 10-month average? The key is really framing the discussion for elected officials and the public especially, that city and county board members have the discipline to build this fund balance to a healthy level, and now they can use a disciplined approach to draw on those reserves in the short term, the rest of this fiscal year, for example, and some for the next. That's consistent with what Chris was citing as a tactic that was successfully used in the last recession. Third principle is important to remember: TANSTAAFL, and resist the political pressure to defer capital maintenance projects touched off by the principal. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch, and it might be reasonable to delay a new building project or, say, construct a new pedestrian bridge over a busy highway. But research has shown that deferring critical maintenance or road work has long-term impacts on the community infrastructure, and it often raises the overall cost of the project. See TANSTAAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. If you cut some critical infrastructure, you're going to pay more and potentially in more ways in the future. So if you're in Dubuque, it may violate one of the council's strategic priorities, which is major roadway maintenance and construction. So here's a COVID-19 bonus. As was mentioned earlier, borrowing money for public works today is about as cheap as it will ever get. The Federal Reserve is practically giving money away for local governments to use for projects. Another bonus of borrowing now is that you get to keep the capital projects going, and you will employ people in your community, boosting your local economy. That means for very low interest rates, you can get a quick return on investment in sales tax and other revenues related to economic swings, and you can improve property values from the improved local infrastructure. And the people who will be using the rebuilt road, bridge, or whatever will be the ones paying the interest on the debt. So let me just shift and show you how some of these choices might play out. I'm going to talk about River City, which looks a lot like Dubuque, Iowa, though just to be clear, it's not the Dubuque budget, and certainly not the one that Mike's going to talk about. But we want to see how a city, River City, can deal with the COVID-19 recession. Now, this is a teaching case that I'm using in my MPA budgeting course. How timely, and I had this idea way before COVID-19 actually came about and the recession hit. So I wanted to make sure that our students understood the importance of understanding how to manage cutback budgets. River City's population is about 60,000, council manager form of government, a seasoned manager. And they have a fund balance before COVID that's about $2.5 million higher than their 20% fund balance policy. So that's all great, but then COVID hits. Road revenues are forecast to drop 2.4 million. They're expecting another 3.2 million in the next fiscal year in terms of lost revenues. So what are the options for an expected $5.6 million deficit? So Balancing Act gives you this kind of page that shows you kind of revenue choices and spending choices. This is being used by local governments across the country. I first met them at an ICMA conference about 3 or 4 years ago. The developers have really been kind enough to create a version that we can use in our classroom teaching. So the first thing that you see is there's a deficit of 5.6 million. You'll see the revenue choices on the left, spending choices on the right. So now you can ask, what are the options citizens or department heads, manager of the council, what is it that they think works? And this is designed for citizen participation in budgeting, but you can actually use this tool internally to discuss options, for example, across department heads and so on. All right, so let's look at one common option, right? Which is, how about cutting back on street repair? You can see among the choices, there's an option to cut 3 miles, instead of $500,000, reduce 4. Wow, that sounds pretty good, right? But if you make this change, this warning pops up regarding the violation of the council's top priorities. Warning, reducing street maintenance violates a top priority of the council's policy agenda. Delaying milling and overlay will increase vehicle costs due to poor road services, may increase accidents, and increase street maintenance case costs overall. So you can say, well, that's fine, I'm still going to make the change, but you're kind of warned. How about public safety? In this option, we're looking at trying to save money by cutting a police officer position, or essentially keeping a freeze on officer positions. Each position is about $84,000. So if you keep all 4 vacant positions, then that's about $340,000. But wait, this option also has a pop-up that says this option violates strategic council priority, which was crime prevention. So at the very least, the strategic goal should be part of the conversation on this option, even if it is an easy short-term solution. Another option that is available is, of course, dipping into that rainy day fund. So here there are several choices, and part of it is to kind of reduce, of course, the excess, the $2.5 million that's in the surplus above the 20%. But then, you know, there are several other options, and you can dip in as much as you want. So the one thing that you can understand is you have choices about how much of that fund balance to use. And in this case, you can get pop-ups that show you, for example, more information about 3.4 million. This violates the city's financial policies. Now, you could change this and say that rainy day fund, this violates the policy, but the rainy day fund is used for lowering it below 20%, right? So the option really is there, and you have to see what's the tolerance for citizens to actually do that. And these particular options here are the ones that dip in below that 20% reserve. But even then, the reserve is meant to spend in bad days. So it's a useful thing to do. All right, so 3 takeaways for everyone. As we think about that, it's not just that these aren't known, but I think it's worthwhile just to remind ourselves as professional finance folks. It's important to frame the conversations now with strategic plans and priorities in mind. And for audience members who are elected officials, your finance officer is hopefully thinking along these lines. We understand the politics. We understand the nuances. It's important to pay attention, internal and external, to these decisions. Don't drain the rainy day pail in the first year. Recessions average, say, 10 to 15 months of rain, so we want to make sure we don't use it all up at once. At the same time, don't be afraid to use it. Don't keep a 20% fund balance because it's recommended. It's recommended that you keep that for when the rain starts pouring. It's important to remind citizens officials of TANSTAAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So deferring capital maintenance projects may raise your overall cost in the long run. And again, the money is available. There's the bargain basement prices for borrowing now. And that also means that people that use those services, those buildings, those roads in the future will be the ones who pay for them. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mike Van Milligan, who has managed his way through more cutback budgeting environments than he ever cares to do.
Kurt, thank you so much. This is Mike Van Milligan, the city manager in Dubuque, Iowa. And I do want to say that I looked at the attendance list, and as someone who went to college at Southern Illinois University and worked on a farm in Alto Pass, Illinois, I want to say hello to the Jackson County, Murfreesboro, and Anna Jonesboro participants. And I just hope the Tip Top Tavern is still in Cobden, Illinois. Not that I ever spent any time there, mind you. First, Dubuque has a population of 60,000 and has 700 city employees. There are 27 different departments with 25 department managers reporting to the city manager. Our leadership team, we define more broadly, and that is about 100 people. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, we vacated all the administrative buildings and over 100 people began working from home. Department managers went from having a weekly meeting to a daily meeting, this time though remotely. We also started a remote all-employee meeting every day at noon with about 200 participants on the line, and it was recorded and put on the city employee network so other employees could listen at their leisure. We started a monthly COVID-19 update public work session with the city council. And every department had to update or do their annual update of the continuity of operations plan, or COOP, because we wanted to be prepared in case COVID-19 struck some of our departments and our employees. And then every department presented at one of the COVID-19 city council work sessions. We had about a 4-hour work session where those 25 departments made their COOP plan presentations to the city council. I believe, and that was a public broadcast meeting with the media there. And I believe this helped to boost the public confidence that we did have a plan. Internally, we reviewed with leadership team our core principles that would be the foundation of our response. And that's what you see on your screen now. Our goal, as directed by City Council, has always been to create an equitable community of choice built on the 4 pillars of resiliency, sustainability, equity, and compassion. We then internally reviewed my management philosophy with leadership team, and that consists of plan your work and work your plan, be input oriented, be problem solvers, develop partnerships, and act with a sense of urgency. We did a group exercise of the leadership team where we asked them to answer 7 questions related to organizational culture to help examine key concepts that we believe would guide our decision making. And to give you an idea of those questions, the final question of the 7 was, if all this ends badly, what would you have wanted to do to make yourself feel proud of how you acted during this pandemic and this economic crisis, despite the end results? We also reviewed the results of the August 2019 City Council goal setting session, because they are the ones that established the priorities, and so we need to make sure we honored that and those. We estimated out of our $200 million annual budget, we would be losing revenues of $4 million in the current fiscal year that ends June 30th, and $12 million in next fiscal year that starts July 1st, 2020. We recommended to City Council that we freeze all vacant positions, we freeze travel and training budgets, we freeze equipment purchases, and we freeze capital projects. We negotiated with our 5 unions a pay freeze, giving all employees no pay raise for the year. I then directed every department to submit 3 alternative budgets at a reduction in resources of 10%, 20%, and 30%. I formed 4 employee work teams to review on a quarterly basis through June 2021 what cuts the city needs to make, and they are to make recommendations to me. This includes a capital projects and equipment team, an operating budget team, a grants team, and a staffing and vacant positions review team. This takes me back to the slide on the screen. As we do all of this, everybody knows in our organization that we need to remember our goal is to create an equitable community of choice built on the 4 pillars of resiliency, sustainability, equity, and compassion. And there are some documents that are attached. There are 3 documents that are attached to this presentation. If you don't have time to review all of them, the key document of the 3 is the Dubuque's response to COVID-19, and that will give you a lot of detail about what we did and how we did it. What we did with this document is we had it printed and we mailed it to every home and business in Dubuque, so 22,000 copies. So every person in Dubuque would have an idea of how we're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. I look forward to any questions that people have after this presentation, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, thank you very, very much for our excellent panel of speakers here. And we have several questions that have been posted in the chat space, and I'm going to work through those questions and ask our speakers to share their responses, but don't continue to add questions to the chat space, and we'll work through those as our time permits. Know that today, again, I'll just remind you that we will be sending you a recording, a link to the recording, and also you'll have access to the handouts that were just discussed by Michael from Dubuque. That will be great resources for you as well. So here's, we've got quite a few questions that relate to the CARES Act funding, and so I'm gonna open that up for Kelly or Taylor to respond to, or any of our panelists. But can you talk a little bit more about the eligibility for the CARES Act, and what are COVID, and specifically the question relates to what are COVID related expenditures as defined by the CARES Act? Kelly, do you want to respond to that?
We could probably send something out to the group or get it to you guys and put it out there on what has been defined. I think it has to be related. Like I said, it has to be a coronavirus related expense. So when we're talking about loss of property tax revenue potentially and different things like that, we're not sure that is going to be allowable. And we're not sure yet how DCO is going to come up with the rules with respect to the reimbursement. So we were promoting a per capita basis, as some other states did. We only, I think, initially saw 1 or 2 states move in that direction. That's what we would have liked to have seen, to ensure that every county in the state and local governments receive funding flow down. However, that may not be the case here in Illinois. So again, we can get you definitions, but I think we're going to need to wait and see what comes out of our state with respect to those regulations. And now that that's been decided, you know, or been moved to DCO, we will try to have some input into that with that agency. Keep in mind, I think right now for local governments, the best thing you could be doing is keeping a running record of things and expenses that you are incurring that would have been out of the norm from what your original budget would have been, or anything incurring costs related to COVID in particular. So those things, especially if you have to, if it ends up having to be on a reimbursement basis, which we are anticipating. We've seen other states moving in this direction as well, which will make it very difficult, I think, for our local governments. If it has to be on a reimbursement basis, you're going to need to have documentation and records of that coronavirus related expenditures. I don't know if any of our other speakers have any input on what's happening in the other states. Okay, Kathy, that's what we know so far. And like I said, I could probably get out some information maybe we could send to you that we could get to the group. Maybe Nancy could on some of the definitions. But again, each state is going to have their own rules and regulations on how this is going to be distributed. So it's kind of difficult right now to estimate how Illinois is going to do this.
Thanks, Kelly. That's helpful, and it sounds like one that we really need to watch. So. I think the other question that is in the chat space, which may go to all 3 of our panelists to respond to, what is the main difference between budget planning now and from the Great Recession? What do you see as differences or similarities between the 2?
I'll start out and just note that, as I said, the kind of uncertainty that we have now is different from, you know, housing bubble, tech bubble. Okay, we see how that's going. This one is different in just what's happened, how it's happened, how fast it's happened. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, because if it's a housing bubble, you can say, well, this is a long period back and so on. If it's a retail service sector, which is a huge section of the economy, and it drops literally in a couple of weeks, that's the kind of uncertainty people don't know. And the biggest uncertainty is, you can open up everything you want to, but if you open it, they may not come, is the big fear. And so if they come, then you're worried that they're going to cause a second wave. So I think it's very prudent for people to think about this as maybe lasting, longer than 10 months. At the same time, I think one of the strategies is really to have flexibility in the budget you're building forward. Since there's greater uncertainty, it calls for really greater flexibility in the way you shape the budget decisions. So one strategy, for example, is to say, okay, here's what we were gonna do in the next year. What if we keep that budget, but now we freeze the positions, right? Because that's where a lot of our money is. And then if they are frozen for 15 months, fine. But if they're only frozen for 4 months, let's not have to go back to the council every time there's a change in the economic situation and say, well, can we add this position back? And some way of balancing, the uncertainty with the need to really move forward. I think that's a prudent way to do that. And that can be true on capital projects. Having people rethink this notion that instead of deferring capital maintenance, this recession is different because the Federal Reserve is literally giving money away, right? It's very, very cheap. That wasn't done in the previous recessions. Eventually, Congress got around to some infrastructure spending, but now you have such huge impact of dollars, trillions of dollars pumped back into the economy. So there's a lot of reason to think that it may not be this long, protracted recession, but we don't know. So designing your budget to be flexible is much different than what we've done in past recessions.
This is Mike Van Milligan from Dubuque. The difference for us was in the Great Recession, the places that had the overheated housing markets were the ones that were hit the hardest. And quite frankly, we never had the overheated housing market. And so our community was not hit anywhere near as hard as like community on the coast or maybe large urban areas like Chicago. And there also was some certainty. The economists and others were able to predict with some level of accuracy of what happens when the housing market turns upside down and things like that. Today, it seems like nobody has a clue what's going to happen. And today is the perfect example. They issued the jobs report numbers for the month of May today, and the projections from the economists, the average projection was there was going to be another 8.3 million lost jobs, except what happened was there was a gain of 2.5 million people working. So that's an 11 million people job number swing. Economists have no clue what's going to happen. And today is just proof of it. Hopefully that means we've hit bottom and now we're going to start coming out of this craziness. But I think the COVID-19 virus is going to be more in charge of that than anybody else.
Christopher, do you have a comment that you want to make?
Oh, just to piggyback off of Mike, the jobs numbers today are certainly encouraging, but there are, and I think a number of you on the call are probably in this situation, is that while the overall economy appears to be doing better, the public economy is doing significantly worse. We saw a net loss of about 500,000 jobs in May in the public sector. So there's certainly some of what I was talking about of lagging the private sector on the public side. Another concern is that it appears, though we don't really know, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, that this encouraging jobs report might lead Congress to not enact a phase for state and local governments and other entities. So there might not be any more federal help coming. That became a much more real possibility today.
Thank you. One of the other questions that's in the chat space is asking, do we have any data that helps us to see what the anticipated revenue shortfalls will be for the state of Illinois? Any any data out there that's pointing in that direction?
So I can speak a little bit to that. There's some work from IPGA at U of I that tries to get at this, and like all of this, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a pretty big range. And this report I'm looking at is from the beginning of April, so it's certainly somewhat out of date. But they're ranging of overall revenue reduction, tax revenue reduction of anywhere from 3 to 16%. So under kind of a mild recession, we get about a 3% decline in 2020, and then we kind of start to come out of it pretty quickly. If it's the worst case scenario, we see a 16% decline in 2020, and we stay there for 2021, and then we start to come out of it. So there's kind of everything in between. So I think any possibility is up in the air right now.
I think that covers the questions. Kelly, there is one more statement about the CARES Act. Do you want to share that? You put it in the chat space, but I wondered if you wanted to make that statement to the group before we close today.
Okay, do you know which statement it was?
Your statement about the governor's office to continue to correspond with.
Oh yeah, I would just recommend that, you know, as local governments, we had the question, should we contact DCEO? I want to kind of put this in your back of your mind. Keep in mind the state is still not operating at full capacity. So again, we know this has been assigned to DCEO. They are a very functioning state agency. We work with them a lot as local governments. But we want to make sure you understand that their capacity right now is somewhat limited too. So we know this has been assigned. I want to be, I don't want to put them or say anything negative, but I want to make sure you understand it's going to take probably a little time for them to get the CARES Act looked at and how the state is going to proceed with this. So we had something similar last year when we had the sexual harassment legislation go through, and that was assigned to DCO. And it did take a couple months, a little longer than we anticipated for them to put that in place as well. So I don't want to give everybody the impression that we think DCO is going to come out next week and have it all fine-tuned and thrown out and ready to distribute. So you're welcome. I would say to correspond with DCO. I would also recommend that I think it's important that you correspond with your local lawmakers and the governor's office. If you draft anything, please send it to all three entities with respect to your needs, what maybe your current expenses and what you've currently incurred. Also, maybe with anticipated fiscal year 2021 expenses. You know, there are worker protection provisions that everybody's been put in place. There are expenses with those, things like that are definitely going to be probably reimbursable. It doesn't hurt to start putting that together. So again, with DCEO, I think we need to be respectful, and I hope that they will be working on this as quickly as they can. And we will continue to stay in communications with them and try to send stuff out to our members. This may be a follow-up webinar, as Kathy and Nancy have you know, alluded to, when we can come back once we see where we believe the state is going with this. But correspondence is fine. I think that's all positive. I would just make sure you let your local lawmakers know about that as well, because with the new commissions that they have sort of formed, that I mentioned earlier on this webinar, they'll be looking at ways to move the state forward. So, you know, if you work with your local lawmakers too, we can maybe get that put forward and to the right parties at the state that are going to be working on this. So hopefully that'll answer your question, Kathy, with respect to, you know, what they can be doing now.
Thank you, Kelly. That's very, very helpful. As we close, I'm going to ask if each of our speakers would give us, you know, kind of their summary takeaways of things that local governments, you know, kind of closing thoughts of what they should be considering, or if there are points that you feel like folks should be considering that maybe didn't come forth in the conversation today. Would you please share those with the group so that we have that on recording, I guess. So I'll go in the same order that we started with. Chris, do you want to share kind of closing thoughts and key ideas that need to be considered from the local government perspectives?
Sure. I just want to echo something that Kurt said, and I mentioned as well, is that this time is the reason that that local government's safe, and that we should be looking at that kind of piggy bank first to try to soften the blow, and then to make more drastic cuts once we get a more fuller extent when necessary. So hanging on to your unreserved net assets right now is we should think about starting to spend those where appropriate.
Thank you. Very helpful. Kurt, do you want to share your kind of closing thoughts?
Right. I think if there's an underlying theme to all this, it's flexibility. Flexibility is a key to resilience, and you can have a plan, and and it's important to have a strategic plan to know your priorities. But then you also have to be flexible in making sure that as you look forward, and quite a few people were preparing their next year's budgets, it's important to do that in a way that maximizes flexibility so that the elected officials and administrators together can extend or retract some of these difficult choices, frozen positions, capital projects, and so on.
This is Mike Van Milligan with Dubuque, and I would say remember your core principles and communicate, both with your employees and the public. And I believe the public will take great comfort in knowing what you're doing and that you have a plan.
Thank you all very much for today's program. Excellent examples, great key messaging for consideration at the community level. And we'll make sure that we share out not only the recording of today's session for everyone who is registered, but any of the handouts and references that you provided in the context of your presentation today. We thank each of you for participating, and you should be able to see that recording within a couple of days on our local government education website. We hope that you'll be able to join us for our next webinar, which will be geared towards community planning and public works. We're going to look at equity in green infrastructure initiatives, and that will be on June 18th. And you'll receive those details as well in the follow-up email from today's programming. Thanks again for your interest, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.